This week on the agenda, 8 billion and counting. As the world's population hits a record high, we speak exclusively to the director of the United Nations Population Division, John Wilmer. It's official. As of the 15th of November 2022, the world's population has risen above 8 billion people. That's more than 3 times the number on Earth in 1950, when there were just 2.5 billion people. And the UN Population Division says this is just the beginning, and the number of people on the planet will continue to grow for decades to come. Life expectancy is set to increase to an average of 77.2 years by 2050. Peak population will be reached around 2080, when there will be some 10.4 billion of us. Now, those are the global figures, but there are some real regional variations. The UNPD's report expects that more than half of population growth by 2050 will come from just 8 countries: the Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Tanzania. And it also warns that as fertility rates fall, the world's going to get older. By 2050, 16% of the world's population will be over 65. That's up from 10% today. Those are the figures, but what's the story behind them? I'm joined now from New York by the director of the United Nations Population Division, John Wilmoth. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on the programme. Now, let's talk about this 8 billion number, because it's being billed as a real milestone for humanity. But as big as it is, it seems that population growth is actually slowing, isn't it?
Globally, the growth has been slowing down. It's a gradual process that's been taking place over the last many decades. And in 2020 was the first time since 1950 that we've had growth that was slower than 1% per year. So it's a slowdown that's taking place gradually over time, and we expect that to continue until the world's population ceases to grow later in this century.
What would you say are the main influencing factors that can contribute towards population growth?
Well, in most countries, growth occurs because there's an excess in the number of births over the number of deaths. There are other countries where growth happens because of migration, or where it's driven primarily by migration, but that's a rarer circumstance. Normally, growth occurs because more people are being born than are dying. And that happens because, essentially, it happens because we've reduced the death rate around the world. We've improved child survival in particular in all countries of the world. This is a universal change, that we've improved survival. And more people survive children survive to the reproductive ages, and then they have more children of their own, and that drives growth as well. But it's the reduction of mortality worldwide. It's essentially a human success story that is behind this growth of the human population. But when the death rate comes down, then populations eventually also reduce the birth rate. And that then brings the population growth more into balance. That tends to happen, but there's a lag in between. And during that lag between the reduction of the death rate and the reduction of the birth rate, there's a period of rapid population growth that takes place. And this has been going on all across the world. It's not just in the rich countries. The growth has gone through, all countries have gone through this process or are going through this process of what we call the demographic transition towards longer lives and smaller families. And in the course of that process, there's a period of rapid growth. And so for the world as a whole, we're still going through that process, and the world is still growing. The global population is still growing.
I do want to talk about that longer life expectancy in a moment, but let's come back to the growth slowing, because if we're living longer and there is less child mortality, how does that add up?
In many countries now, the birth rate, the fertility rate, that's to say the number of births per woman over a lifetime, has fallen below 2.1 births per woman. And that's the level at which a population would achieve zero growth over the long run. If that's maintained for a long period of time, 2.1 births per woman in a population with low mortality, that produces zero growth in the long run. So now we're in a situation where more than half of the world's population is living in countries where the fertility rate has fallen below that threshold of 2.1. So that means that the long-term tendency in those countries is for the population to start decreasing eventually. If the birth rate stays at that level, at the fertility rate below 2.1 births per woman, if it's maintained at that level, those countries will eventually start decreasing in size, and some of them already have started decreasing. So the future is probably one of at least modest decrease of populations, and that's already occurring in some countries, and we expect that it will occur globally by the end of the century.
Let's talk about the countries where we've seen growth spurts, because more than half of the projected population spurts by the time global population peaks are going to be felt in just 8 countries. Is that a concern?
Well, in some ways it is, if you consider that most of the growth moving forward will occur in countries that are relatively poor, with fewer resources to accommodate the increased population, and to have the resources to expand the school systems and the healthcare systems to welcome these new residents, new citizens of their countries. Let's say most of them born there. That's what's driving the growth in most of those countries is the births that are occurring there. But to accommodate that growth, you need to expand the school system, for example, and the healthcare system, and everything else that is needed to recruit the next generation successfully, to raise them as successful, productive human beings who can contribute to the economies and to their societies where they live.
You mentioned the difference between developed and developing nations in terms of how growing populations or shrinking populations can be managed. What do we need to zone in on there?
I guess all countries face their own demographic challenges in some sense. In countries where growth is occurring rapidly, now that's where it's driven by a high fertility rate, people may desire smaller families and not always have access to the means of achieving that. So it's important that governments ensure that people have access to the means of contraception and birth control, so that they can choose the size of their families and determine the number of children that they want to have and when they want to have them. But in other countries where growth is much slower, or where it's even gone negative, where the fertility rate is rather low, there are also issues of whether people are able actually to have the number of children that they would like to have. That's to say that many people find it challenging in many more developed countries in Europe, North America, East Asia, where we see these very low fertility rates. It's often a question of people not being able to successfully manage the requirements of family and work at the same time. And it's important for governments in those countries to address those issues and to think about how to make it feasible for people to manage and balance, to find a balance between work and family, so that they can have the families that they want. In many cases in those countries, people report having a desire to have more children than what they actually have.
Let's talk about life expectancy, because that's 9 years more than it was in 1990, a big leap in a relatively short space of time. What's behind that?
If you look across the world, the biggest factors have been the reduction of child mortality, mortality at younger ages, because that has a big impact on life expectancy. If you save a child who then goes on to live to be 70 years old, you've increased life expectancy by quite a bit. Somebody that might have died very young in life, and then they make it through that rough period, that vulnerable period early in life, and then they survive to older ages, you've made quite a big increase in life expectancy. If you save a 70-year-old who lives then to be 80, you've made a smaller increase in life expectancy because the gain has been smaller. But so the biggest gains come by reducing child mortality. And so in the countries where child mortality was still relatively high in 1990, we've made enormous progress in reducing that. That's one area where we've actually successfully achieved the Millennium Development Goals, and where the Sustainable Development Goals are somewhat more on track in some of these areas of health, that we will achieve them. And so the reduction in child mortality has been very impressive, and that's driven a lot of the increase. There have been gains over this time period that you mentioned since 1990. The increase of life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa has partly been driven by the the successful reduction of the AIDS epidemic and reduction of deaths in particular. AIDS is still an issue in those areas, but the mortality caused by AIDS has gone down over this time period, and that's contributed to the increase. But it's really, it's many factors. In more developed countries over this time period, there have been reductions in cardiovascular diseases that are driven by continuing medical progress and interventions that help with the management of those diseases at older ages. And so it's really across the world, there are a variety of factors that have contributed to the increase of life expectancy. But you're correct, 9 years increase in 3 decades is quite impressive for the world as a whole.
And that increase in life expectancy then has an impact on so many things, from labour markets to pension schemes. Do you think we need to rethink the way those are run?
Not all countries have pension schemes, unfortunately. So, I mean, our first concern should be ensuring that such systems exist in countries where they don't exist, and to have coverage of those systems so that everyone receives the kind of protection that those provide at older ages. But in countries where such systems exist, then there are issues of the sustainability of the financing in light of the increase of life expectancy. So you tend to have more and more people at older ages, and the balance between people at older ages and people in the working ages becomes more challenging in terms of the number of people who need to be supported per worker. But at the same time that you have an increase in the older population in these aging societies, you also have a decrease in the number of children. So you have a reduction in the total, you have a reduction in the dependency at younger ages and increase in the dependency at older ages. But as far as the impact of life expectancy and the change of life expectancy, I think the way to think about it is that, yes, there's this shift in the population from younger to older ages. You'll have more dependence at older ages, fewer dependence at younger ages as a result. But in general, the life course and how we think about the life course is changing. People stay in school longer, so they spend more time as children and youth, let's say, before they become active in the labor market. And then it's possible that at the other end of life, later at the end of their careers, people may wish to continue working longer, or there's the possibility that they can because they're healthier. 65-year-olds in countries today, that may be the retirement age, but many people are very healthy and capable of continuing to work at that age. And I think it's important to make it possible for people to continue working as long as they would like, and as long as they're able to do so. And so we shouldn't be forcing people out of the labor market. We should be enabling them to continue working if that's what they would like to do, and if they're still capable of doing that. Many people have contributions to be made beyond that magical retirement age that we've somehow fixated upon, this age of 65 in many countries. And that's not the point at which people necessarily lose their productivity or their possibility of contributing. So we don't want to lose the contributions of older people, and at the same time we don't want to force people to continue working if they're ready for retirement.
Speaking of older people, the issue of elderly care becomes more acute, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The care economy faces many challenges. We saw that especially during COVID. Older people who were in nursing homes were much more vulnerable for various reasons. But the care economy there are many issues involved in that area. It's often staffed by women and migrants who are relatively underpaid, and we need to pay attention to that as an institution in terms of how we treat the workers there, and how the care is provided, and what's guaranteed, or who is covered by such systems. There are issues of coverage to ensure that the entire older population or the entire population has access to care when needed, but there are also issues of how that industry is structured and how it compensates its workers, and much of the work is underpaid or informal in various ways, or sometimes it's handled informally through families, just from often female members of the family who are caregivers. So there are various issues around how we structure the care that's provided as the population becomes older and older. It becomes increasingly important to think about that.
A big conversation this year in particular has been food insecurity, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine and by some of the extreme weather events that we've been having. Can the world actually supply a growing population with enough food, with agriculture as it is, or does that need a rethink?
Well, despite many predictions that the world would not be able to feed a growing population over the last decades, I mean, there have many times been predictions where people said it would be impossible to grow enough food to feed the growing population. We've successfully increased the global food supply faster than the human population, so that per capita food production has gone up, and per capita consumption of food has gone up globally, and that's reflected in the increase of life expectancy. So it's not an unmitigated disaster by any means. We've managed to grow more food to feed the population. That being said, I think we can anticipate that something similar will happen in the future. I don't believe the problem is that we fundamentally cannot grow enough food for a growing human population. The problems are the problems of distribution that you mentioned, the problems of distribution and political violence that make it difficult to distribute food that's been grown, or to distribute fertilizer and other assets that are needed to grow food. So there are problems of political conflict that affect the distribution of food, and there are things that affect people's access to food. There's no denying that, but it's not our overall ability to grow the food that's the fundamental problem in terms of supplying food to people. So that's one side of it. In terms of the supply, I think it's possible to grow enough food. The question is, will it be distributed? Will it be accessible to people? But then there are other issues related to what are the impacts of all that food production and consumption on the global environment. And that's a very serious issue as well.
John, let's pause there for a moment, but stay with us, as still to come here on the agenda, the population may be rising, but fertility rates are falling. We'll find out what that means for social progress.
Roger, Ricky, loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and the crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Welcome back to The Agenda. Let's continue now with our exclusive interview with John Wilmoth, the Director of the United Nations Population Division. While the world's population is still growing, fertility rates are falling, especially in places like Europe. What does that fall mean for social progress?
I guess everyone, historically everyone was happy that fertility was falling in some sense, because population was growing so rapidly over the last many decades, and people were concerned about global growth and slowing the growth. And then the birth rate fell, but it fell so much that in some countries it went to very low levels, and the population started aging very rapidly, and in some cases started to decline in size. And that became a cause of concern for some populations, because there was a concern about the balance of the age structure, having such a growth of the older population relative to the working age population. That became a cause of concern. And then in some cases where populations started declining, countries see that as potentially losing influence in the world, because their population is going to be smaller on a percentage basis in the world than it had been. And is that really a serious cause of concern? The relative size of countries compared to each other? Well, I think there's a natural tendency to feel that way, but is that really fundamentally a problem for a country like Japan, that its population is becoming smaller? There may be some advantages to that, and the question is how to manage that change. All of these changes in human population, they're things that people can adapt to. Societies can adapt to these changes, but the challenge is the speed at which they're happening. And so when we kind of go to extremes, that's when people become concerned. And so when populations are growing by more than 1% per year, that's kind of rapid growth, and that's a concern. And when populations start declining if they're really falling rapidly, then that's a cause for concern. But slight changes, slight increase, slight decrease shouldn't be a major cause for concern to countries. So I think it's really a question of addressing the extremes. And in some countries, there are what we call very low levels of fertility, where births per woman have fallen below 1.5 and even below 1.2 or even 1.0 births per woman over a lifetime. And that's a very low level. And that leads to very rapid aging of the population if it's maintained over several decades, and eventually to population decrease. So I think there is an interest in attenuating the extremes, let's say, reducing fertility in situations where it's very high and propping it up or supporting people in having children in countries where the fertility rate is very low.
Now, India is expected to pass China from next year and become the world's most populous country. How important is that?
I think the importance is mostly symbolic. It's a gradual change. These two countries are still very large. They're still much larger than any other countries. They each account for around a fifth of the world's population. So in practical terms, if one is slightly larger than the other, I don't think that's a major deal. That doesn't change anything fundamentally in terms of the economy, their economies or their societies. But I think there is a symbolic importance in terms of which country is the largest in the world, and the claims that they may make in terms of their place in the world. And this is to be worked out moving forward. We'll see what kind of claims the countries make as a result of this. But it's not a fundamental issue. It's a symbolic issue in terms of which is the largest population in the world.
Something else I wonder if you think will have an impact on geopolitics is the average age, and how there's a huge gap between the average age region to region. Is that going to shake things up politically?
Well, we're at a point where there's this great demographic diversity in the world because of the fact that even if all countries are going through the same process of demographic transition towards longer lives and smaller families, they're going through it at different points in time. So there's this great diversity in the current situation of those countries. But while there may be a difference in the average age today, the trend for all regions of the world is the same, in that the average age is going up. And it will go up more rapidly in countries where it is the lowest. And I think over time we will see a convergence in these average ages. I think we're at a point where we have almost maximum demographic diversity in the world right now, because countries are at different stages of going through this demographic transition. And that's led to a lot of variation across the world in terms of the type of age distribution, the speed of growth, and various demographic indicators that are quite variable across the world. But since all populations are going through this similar process and kind of going toward a similar endpoint of smaller families and longer life expectancies, that there won't be as much difference in the future is what I'm saying. I think that we will see some convergence over time in the average ages.
There is quite a big gap, though. I mean, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's around about 17 years old. In Europe, just over 41 years old. I know you're saying they're all going to even out. That's a big gap.
No, I'm talking about evening out over many decades. I mean, by the end of the century. So it's true that in our kind of current time frame, this is a very big difference, and it's not something that's going to disappear soon. And it does have implications, obviously, in terms of the labor market over the next few decades, and the requirements of finding jobs for those people, for the young people. It will have implications. There's no doubt. The difference in the age distribution that we observe right now, that will add pressure to young people who may want to migrate from countries of Africa to Europe, for example. I know that's a cause of concern in many countries in Europe, but that demographic pressure is going to be there for sure. It's going to provide a push and a pull in terms of, I mean, there are demographic push factors and pull factors, there are economic push factors and pull factors, but I'm just speaking I'm just speaking about the demographic ones right now.
Yeah.
And just in terms of just the sheer size of the youth population in many countries, that provides a certain push where they may not have opportunities for jobs in their countries, and they may look abroad. But also there's a great pull from the fact that in richer countries there are opportunities, and people see those opportunities, and they go for them. They migrate because they have heard stories of their friends and family who have moved abroad and who have made fortunes and sent money home. They see examples of this, and so of course naturally they want to take off and explore and see what opportunities are out there for them. So there will definitely be both demographic push and pull factors. The pull factors, the demographic pull factors in developed countries, the fact that the populations are aging and they need workers. So there's a pull, just a demographic pull in terms of the shrinking labor force in some European countries and some other developed countries. That provides a pull in terms of just needing people, needing laborers, workers.
John, you practically eat, sleep and breathe these numbers. So as you've been digging in, is the world overpopulated, especially amid climate change? Or should we be talking less about the number of people on the planet and maybe more about distribution and equity of resources?
We started to get into this earlier in terms of we were talking about the food system and can we grow enough food for everyone? And I was starting to say that, you know, even though we're able to grow the amount of food that's needed to feed this growing population, even if that's possible, we have to think about what the consequences of that are. And the food system currently contributes about between a quarter and a third of the greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere today. About a quarter to a third of that comes from the food system. That includes not only production, but also distribution and storage and everything that is part of the food system. So, you know, very broadly, we need to think about how that system works, because probably we cannot reach the climate goals that we have unless there are changes also in agriculture and how the whole food system is managed. And so that's a major issue. You know, we may be able to support this many people on the planet. We may be able to keep them alive. We may be able to continue increasing their life expectancies, but we need to think about what are the after effects of all that human activity and consumption. I think people used to be worried about running out of resources and not being able to grow enough food and not being able to find enough oil or sources of energy. That's not really the problem in the end. Humans are very clever about and resourceful about finding the resources that are needed in order to continue improving the quality of life for human beings and continuing to raise life expectancy around the world. That's not the problem. The problem is, what are the after effects of all that consumption and economic activity? How are we changing the world around us? How are we changing the atmosphere in particular, and the impact that that's having on climate, and the impact that the climate change is having on people's lives across the board? And so the risk is not one of, it's not that we won't be able to continue growing. The question is, what will be the impacts of that growth and the quality of the life that we will create for ourselves and for other species on this planet if we continue acting as we are? The population size is one factor, but the way that we act, the way that we behave, the way that the economy is organized, that is overall a larger factor that we need to address. And we should never be under the illusion that somehow if we stopped global population growth, all these problems would go away. They would not.
John Wilmoth, Director of the UN Population Division, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, COP27 is over, but what has it achieved? Are we any closer to saving the planet in the wake of Sharm el-Sheikh? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all of the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.